afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 20th installment of the PATS, Professional and Academic Development Series. This is an event organized by the Emphasis in ELT Education of the Interinstitutional Doctoral Program at Univalle and the Group of Research, EILA, Equipo de Investigación en Lingüística Aplicada. I would also like to tell you that you can always visit our Facebook fan page for more updates on what's going on in the program. And we are also on YouTube. We have a YouTube channel where we upload the videos of our previous pads. Today we have a special guest, my friend and colleague, Dr. Kristen Michelson. She is an assistant professor of French and applied linguistics at Texas Tech University. Her scholarship is anchored in Multiliteracies Pedagogies and is currently focused on investigating how L2 learners of French interpret everyday internet texts. She has employed various methodologies in solo and collaborative research projects, including digital social annotated reading. Her work aims to raise awareness of how representational choices are made with agency and intention against a backdrop of broader social contexts, and to provide opportunities for second language learners to understand and participate flexibly in cultural discourses of target language cultures. I'd like to welcome Dr. Michelson, and thank you very much for being here, for accepting this invitation to participate at the PATS.
Thank you so much, my dear friend, Dr. Jose Alvarez Valencia, for the invitation. And in a minute, I'm going to share my screen and show presentation, and you're going to get a bit of a best of. But I want to especially say thank you for the opportunity to be here and be part of your program in this way. Today, we're going to take advantage of technology, and I'm going to try to make it as smooth as possible. All right. So again, thank you so much for the invitation, Jose, and for all of you for being here. What I'm going to do today is talk more about pedagogies and not so much about my research, although a lot of my research is related to the teaching and learning of foreign languages. So what I'm going to talk about today is how multiliteracies pedagogies can be leveraged for teaching language and culture holistically. So first, we'll talk about some problems with culture teaching. Then we'll look at what multiliteracies pedagogies are, why they're well suited for integrated culture and language teaching. And then finally, we'll look at some examples of texts and tasks in service of those goals. So if we think about culture and language teaching, what are some of the problems with the way culture is taught in foreign and second language educational contexts? And I wish I was with you and could see you, because we would make this a Q&A, but I'm going to go ahead instead and share some of the things that have been said to be problematic. One, culture is often taught separately from language, with a view that culture knowledge is transferred through literary works. Sometimes culture has been taught as a catalog or an inventory of behaviors, or as lists of objects of difference. These approaches treat culture as static, monolithic collections of facts or knowledge. Instead, we can think of culture as a relational process, whereby we come to terms with our own positions as culturally situated subjects in every act of communication and social life. In order to successfully interact within society, we must develop culture general and culture specific skills and strategies for interaction. Another way culture has been described by one of my favorite scholars, Claire Cronch, is as a relational process through linguistically mediated membership into a discourse community. Note that language and culture are in a symbiotic relationship with one another. So what do we mean by discourse communities? One way we can think about this is to consider the groups to which we belong, where within a particular group there are common values and ways of expressing the world, so through language, image, etc. And so in a way, discourse communities are like speech communities, except that using the term discourse communities also implies a symbiotic relationship between language and culture. It really captures this connection. So we know that within discourse communities, there are normative cultural practices and conventions, and these are also connected with language. But discourse communities are not monolithic entities that map onto national groups, and we're all members of multiple discourse communities. Our identities are implicated in our discourse community memberships. Some of these memberships are chosen, some of these are given. So how can we achieve then this interconnectedness in foreign and second language teaching? One way we can do that is through texts. So while it's not a new idea to teach foreign languages with and through authentic texts, often the way that we've used texts is in a way that still prioritizes language and does not adequately address culture. For example, how many of us have in the past had before us the task of developing a language lesson where the stated topic was the past tense? And then in trying to think about ways to help learners see the structure and context, we have maybe combed the internet or other resources for interesting texts that might exemplify this structure. Perhaps no one in this audience has done this, but in my last decade of mentoring teachers, I've seen this quite a lot. And I believe I did this when I was learning teaching at one point too. So today what I'm hoping is that you go away from this presentation with some new ideas about how to find and use texts in a way that links culture and language through discourse. So first, let's talk about what is special about texts. I especially like this quote from Catherine Arends from a work in 2009 about texts, where she says, texts are not only sources of linguistic knowledge and cultural facts, but are also representations of how culture is created and how it functions. They must be engaged not only for language and elements of content, but also as strategic interventions on the field of culture, as examples of how knowledge is produced, circulated, and managed. And what I especially like, and the idea that I want to keep throughout this workshop, is that texts are representations of how culture is created and how it functions. Arends further goes on to suggest that texts need to be approached as elements in cultural networks, and the bolding is my own for emphasis. Cultural networks that implicate not only language acts, but also a broader social science view of culture, including anthropological and sociological systems. It's sociology, social semiotics, organized power structures, institutions, groups, policies, and the social psychology and identity politics of individuals within it. So we're going to see shortly how texts can be approached as elements in cultural networks. We're also going to see how texts do much more than just act as carriers of culture or carriers of language. And we're going to see instead how texts implicate groups, identities, and organizations. So what I'd like to do next is lead us in a guided activity in textual analysis so that we can experience the way texts work. And then we can think about how we might use some of these principles in language teaching. All right, so first, what do you imagine when you think of okay, so maybe you have some ideas about what that means to you. What we're going to do is look at 5 different examples of different text types that treat this topic and in different ways. So let's take a look at the first example, and I'll read you each text. It had a perfectly round door like a porthole, painted green, with a shiny yellow brass knob in the exact middle. The door opened onto a tube-shaped hall like a tunnel, a very comfortable tunnel without smoke, with paneled walls and floors tiled and carpeted, provided with polished chairs and lots of pegs for hats and coats. The owner was fond of visitors. The tunnel wound on, going fairly, but not quite straight into the side of the hill. The hill, as all the people for many miles round called it, and many little round doors opened out of it, first on one side and then the other. So how might you characterize this text type? Maybe you have an intuitive sense, maybe you know this text, or if you don't, maybe you have an intuitive sense that this is a description. So let's look at this text in more detail to see if we can track some of the patterns of description. We see here a pattern of verb phrases. It had, the door opened, the tunnel wound, etc. We also see long complements with embedded clauses, mostly full of nouns, adjectives, and so for example, round door like a porthole, painted green, with a shiny yellow brass knob in the exact middle, etc. Okay, let's look at another example. Beautiful neighborhood, former parade of home, so a lot of unique features. From the moment you walk in, you can see the beautiful patio in the backyard. Lots of big windows throughout, beautiful custom crown molding throughout. Very spacious with 4 bedrooms, one of which can be used for office with 2 glass doors. Master bedroom has double closets and bathroom, whirlpool bath, double vanities, and door that leads out to patio. Large kitchen with island, breakfast area, huge windows, and new granite. Formal dining area, large basement with half bath that's perfect for a man cave. Large fenced side area. Beautiful hardwood floors in the main living areas and master bedroom, carpet in all bedrooms, and tile in kitchen area. Surround sound in living room, master, and patio. A must see. What kind of a text is this? You might also call this a description, although you might have noticed that it works very differently than the previous text. The subject-verb complement pattern that we saw in the previous text is not repeated here. In fact, if we take a closer look, we don't really even have subjects or verbs. We just have complements. We have noun phrases, and in these phrases, we have many specialized words that relate to features of a home. We just have one example of a sentence with a verb, and you might notice the verb has, which sets up a relationship of possession with the nouns in the complement. Okay, so let's take another example. As you know, the large sliding windows on the bottom floor in the lobby are secured by turn locks that can be easily forced open. On occasion, we have seen a dowel placed in the track to prevent the windows from being opened, but lately the dowels have often been missing. Several times the windows have been left open all night. We are worried that an intruder will have an easy time of getting into the building. There have been several burglaries in the neighborhood within the past 2 months. The situation would be greatly helped if you could send a glass repair person to replace the locks with much stronger ones. Needless to say, a burglary or assault is a worrisome prospect. So what do we have here? Maybe you said an appeal? Maybe you said a letter? Let's see how this one is realized.
A request?
Maybe a request? Yeah, so there's an intuitive sense about how these texts work, but let's analyze them in more detail then. So as you know, we have seen. So what do we have here? One pattern we might notice is the repetition and alternation of pronouns. So in this text, different from the other 2 that we saw, 2 different interlocutors are directly evoked through these pronouns you and we, and then we and you in the second paragraph. Maybe these individuals or entities are still impersonal and unknown to us, but we see that this text has already set up a dialogue of sorts, even if only implied. If we look at keywords, we might notice words associated with worries, burglaries, security, etc. Okay, so here's a 4th example out of our 5. Our rental home has had numerous problems and is in need of repair. We have had issues with the windows not latching and falling on their own. We are limited to which windows we can open. I ripped out numerous carpets that had years of mess and filth in them. There are uneven floors upstairs and problems with the faucets. The cracks on the wall and the ceiling are getting bigger. I took all the bedroom doors down as they were so damaged. You had to lift up on them to shut them. They were also splintering and it was not safe. There is a little cabinet space in the kitchen and limited storage space for food, forcing us to use other areas to store our food. The water pressure is altered by our neighbors. The water in the home is also not safe to drink. I received an email from my children's school informing me that the program was looking for future homeowners. I went to the meeting to learn more and I chose to apply. I was beside myself when I received a call from the program saying that I was accepted into the program. My children were thrilled. So what kind of a text is this? We could say perhaps that this is a testimonial, and there might be other responses to this as well. But I'm going to suggest that it's a testimonial. And let's look now at how this text type is realized. So here again, we might notice the preponderance of pronouns, but unlike the previous text where the pronouns were limited to we and you, we have a wider range. The first person is now plural, at least in the first paragraph. So we know that whoever is writing this is speaking for a group, on behalf of a group. We also have a semantic field that foregrounds problems with the rental home. Damaged, problems, filth, crack, mess, etc. Okay, taking a fifth and final example. Let's look at this text. Homeownership rates are at nearly 50-year lows. This is true across all demographic groups, but is most pronounced for younger adults. The foreclosure crisis clearly is a significant contributor to these historically low rates of homeownership. But other factors such as lack of available credit, slow income growth, and delayed household formation are also at play. As a result, while homeownership is likely to increase if income continues to rise and the economy strengthens, it is unclear whether ownership rates will ever return to pre-recession levels. The lack of access to affordable housing contributes significantly to the concentration of poverty, and this effect is increasing over time. In 2000, 6.5 million Americans lived in high poverty neighborhoods, defined as having a poverty rate of more than 40%. Now, almost 14 million live in such neighborhoods. Living in high poverty neighborhoods has many negative consequences, particularly for children, and is a major contributor to generational poverty. So what do we have here? Perhaps you said informational text, and perhaps you might notice that this is certainly more of an expository text than the other narrative texts we've seen. So let's look at how this text is realized. And you might have already noticed some of these things already. So looking at the first part of each sentence, or what we might call the theme in some frameworks, we have noun phrases. Our noun phrases might have an adjective or might be some prepositional phrases, but there are no first-person pronouns. It's a very impersonal text in a sense, right? Any pronouns are in the third person. Okay, so now that we've seen these text types, let's synthesize. Let's see if we can draw any conclusions about patterns of linguistic choices and textual genres. So again, these are the genre possibilities we saw. And we might say that in a description, we saw two texts that we called descriptive texts. We saw a preponderance of adjectives, and typically a sentence pattern characterized by a subject-verb complement sentence order. In the appeal text, we saw many second-person pronouns. In the testimonial, it was more first-person pronouns. In our informational text, we had lots of nominalizations, lots of embedded clauses, lots and lots of nouns. So what can we say then about genres? We can say that genres involve conventions and that they construe potentials or possibilities in terms of language use. We can also say that cultures organize meaning potentials into, quote, recurrent configurations of meaning, and this comes from Martin's work. Going beyond forms, we can also say that texts contain ensembles of semiotic resources that combined in pattern ways for particular social purposes. So here, it's not just about form, it's not just about linguistic or semiotic dimensions, but it's also about social dimensions. So if we're talking about a material artifact, texts, for example, that integrates linguistic and social dimensions, now we're talking about culture and discourse together. Okay, so now that we've looked at some of these linguistic patterns, let's see if we can identify any patterns in the cultural messages conveyed in these texts. Okay, so what are some of the discourses about home evoked by the ensemble of these texts? So you might think, for example, of some of the messages or ideologies conveyed about what home means. For example, what are the important elements of a home, who's allowed to have one, etc. So I'll pause for just a minute and see if there are any responses. I can't see you, but if you can unmute, or if you want to offer a response in another way through chat, and then maybe Jose, you could read them, or I don't know the best format.
Yes, I'm here, and if you want me to read the chat messages whenever they write?
Yeah, maybe just a few.
All
Home
right.
is what? What is sort of evoked by the ensemble of these texts?
All right, someone is saying, Sol is saying, home is a safe place.
Yeah, home is safe. That comes through very clearly. What else?
Yeah, Omaira says, okay, Carlos says, most of them focus on physical aspect of the home. And Omaira says, home is to be a safe place.
Okay, so we have this theme of safe that has been picked up by several of you, and we've seen a lot of home features. Okay, so some of the things that I thought of were this message about safety, security, the idea that home should be cozy, and we have this through some of our descriptions, should be comfortable, and also this message that it's better to own a home than to rent a home. Home ownership rates are down, this is bad. Renting a home we saw is full of problems, and there's an appeal to probably a landlord to fix these problems. So these are just some potential message systems or discourses that circulate through these texts. Okay, so one thing that you might have noticed with the previous activity sequence and texts was that they were full of written language and not much else. So for the purpose of that activity, I extracted the linguistic mode from multimodal texts in order for us to focus just on that part. However, if we look at texts in their original habitats, we see that all of these texts are inherently part of multimodal complexes. And we're going to see how adding back in the visual mode is going to give us information that the linguistic mode alone did not give us. For example, here's the book cover for one version of this well-known classic by J.R.R. Tolkien that we saw in example 1. So you might have recognized that if you read The Hobbit. For example 2, here is now the rest of that text or some other part of it. And so you might have noticed for text number 2 that that was a real estate ad or some kind of housing ad, the one that didn't have any subjects or verbs. It just had a series of noun phrases. So this is the rest of it. So if you look at the visual modes here, what visual modes do we have? And what information does the visual mode carry that the linguistic mode does not? Well, we can see that we have icons. We can see the price. We couldn't see that from the previous message. By the way, this is a ridiculously expensive home. This is not typical. but the linguistic mode and the way this house go together are, I find, exceptionally salient in terms of the way it's described. It's a palace. It's a parade of homes. It was on a circuit for tours, for example. So we have some complementary information, supplemental to what we got from the linguistic mode alone, and we also have some redundant information. There was mention of a man cave. Now we have an image of what the man cave perhaps looks like, et cetera, et cetera. So in example 3, what non-linguistic modes are salient here? We've got spatial layout. Now that we've seen the spatial layout here and the fuller context of the text, we see that this is a letter. And we might have intuited this by reading the language in the previous example, which of course I truncated. So this spatial layout already gives us some clues into the genre and helps us understand, even from the get-go, how to read this text. In other words, if we think of a letter and some of the prototypical uses of a letter, we know that letters have audiences. We're writing to someone, and that's there's a clear interlocutor. So we can already expect the prototypical use of pronouns to sustain this relationship between writer and reader. Okay, so looking at this example, what visual mode is salient here? Here we have image, we have color, we have logos, we have what look like navigation bars on a website. So there are many things that we can learn from these modes in these texts that we couldn't know from the written language. For example, who gets to own a home? Where are the homes? In this last text, we have, again, logos, images, color. We have a tagline, investing in communities since 1992, a sort of motto. We also have navigational bars, so we might know that this is from a website. We've got pictures of some kind of homes here. And there are things, again, that we learn from this text that we don't necessarily learn from the previous text. And what I want to talk about now is this notion of design and how it's implicated in this pedagogical approach of multiliteracies. So I'm going to talk about multiliteracies pedagogies, and then we're going to see how design is understood. And this might be familiar to many in this audience. Some aspects might be new, some might be familiar. So I'll look forward to having more of a conversation in the Q&A. So in thinking about multiliteracies pedagogies, first I want to talk about what it is and where it originated. One way we can start to conceptualize multiliteracies is by asking whether it's an approach, a method, a theory, whether it refers to techniques. And in fact, it's been considered all of these. So first I'm going to talk about it as an approach, and then we're going to experience, and then we're going to look at some corresponding methods and techniques. So the term multiliteracies can be traced to a group of scholars who called themselves the New London Group, who were scholars and educationalists from applied linguistics, social semiotics, communication studies, and they happened to meet in the town of New London at a conference, I believe, New London, New Hampshire in 1994, to talk about changes that were happening in communication landscapes and the ways that pedagogies would need to adapt to teaching literacies relevant to new forms of communication. So in their seminal article, which emerged after this meeting, A Pedagogy of Multiliteracies, Designing Social Futures, this New London group, as they came to be known, outlined what they saw as the direction of literacy and education for the future. And they coined this term multiliteracies. So this is the beginning of their group, and these are the names of the original authors of the New London Group. So multiliteracies, in their view, was a perfect term to describe the new kinds of literacies that would be needed for success in a world with ever-disappearing boundaries and borders, increased mobility, increasingly diverse communities in terms of cultural and linguistic backgrounds, new knowledge economy that would require flexibility, innovation, collaboration, all within flattened hierarchical structures. So literacy, which was traditionally defined as encoding and decoding primarily written language, was redefined by this group as multi, which referred to different multimodal resources for meaning making, different multiple ways that meanings could be made, multitudes of different backgrounds and social histories brought to a communication situation. So the New London group proposed the metaphor of design. And in this view, designing is an active process of drawing on available design resources from one's social, cultural, historical context and engaging in an active, interested process of redesigning. In this process of redesigning, we're talking about creating new signs. And we might think of available resources as grammar, images, cultural knowledge, experiential knowledge, a speaker's use of particular language forms, formal, informal register, for example. And these might be based on speakers' identities, cultures of learning, cultures more broadly, knowledge of discourse community norms, intent or purpose, or even the social expectations of the communication context. Notice here that we have the notion of design referring to material resources, linguistic resources, embodied resources, identity, and experiential resources. So another key principle in the New London Group's proposal was that all meaning making is multimodal. And we saw how the different modes in the previous texts were necessary in order to convey fuller meaning. So the New London Group's project was later adapted by Bill Cope and Mary Kalantzis, and they were part of the original New London Group and called their project Learning by Design. And this has continued to evolve. And this essentially departs from the same principles as the original proposal, and has had really an equally prolific uptake in general and foreign language education. And many of you may have encountered this already. So regardless of which camp one works with, various notions are key to multiliteracies approaches. Number one, social roles and identities are always at work in the processes of meaning making. Two, meaning making is multimodal. Three, meaning is designed based on available resources, like the ones that we talked about earlier. So how does a multiliteracies approach understand language or learning or language using? Language, in this view, is seen as a set of symbolic resources. So these are tools or resources for meaning making. Learners come with their own diverse histories, and so learning should involve agency in learning how to use these symbolic resources flexibly. And in so doing, language using is about transforming a system, about redesigning meanings, about recreating new possibilities. So now let's look at multiliteracies frameworks that could help us in our own and students' encounters with texts. So in the original proposal, the New London Group outlined this heuristic that they called the 4 curricular components, and they named these situated practice, overt instruction, critical framing, transformed practice, where each of these are considered, quote, pedagogical acts. They each involve a different kind of engagement with text. So situated practice is like hands-on immersion, an interpretive capacity. It's what we just did with all of the home texts. Could be reading, could be listening, could be viewing. And overt instruction is more of an instructor-guided exploration of a text's form and how those forms are linked to meaning. So in a way, we did that too. And we're going to see how these different pedagogical acts, in fact, were inherent in the activity that we just did. Critical framing is reflection on a text's underlying ideologies that simultaneously reflect and constitute particular discourses, and then transformed practice is an application activity where learners engage in textual production, redesigning ideas and language encountered through interpretive activities from their own situated positions. So there's this idea of texts being situated within social and cultural contexts and individuals as well. So Cope and Calancis, as I mentioned, who developed the Learning by Design project, later renamed these pedagogical acts. And these terms are, I think, much easier to work with in a teaching and learning and even researching capacity. So these are things like describing, exploring, observing, connecting, classifying, extrapolating, hypothesizing, generalizing, comparing, synthesizing, critiquing, understanding, composing, constructing, designing, demonstrating. So these are terms, if you're familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, that are very similar conceptually to many of those terms, but they're rearranged in different ways to emphasize the non-hierarchical nature and the way that we're talking about engagement with text. What do we do with a text, and how does that help us in our process of coming to terms with the world in order to operate more flexibly within it? So if we think about texts or pedagogical acts as ways of knowing, these are some of the ways that the Learning by Design project, the Cope and Calancis project, has broken these down. And I will share, if you're interested, some of these links afterwards if these are of interest. Okay, so let's look at the sequence that we just experienced. I'm just going to show what we just did and name these pedagogical acts. So when we thought about home, we were activating schemata, which is a way that many of us think about this, activating background knowledge. We were experiencing the known. Then as we explored new texts, we were still experiencing, looking at different examples of new kinds of texts. And maybe, again, this was an example of experiencing the known if anyone was familiar with this text. Then we conceptualized, we named what we were looking at, what kinds of texts we were looking at. Then we analyzed them functionally. We looked at how language worked to realize those genres. And then we took a step back and we did some conceptualizing by theorizing, perhaps, what conclusions we could draw about patterns of linguistic choices in textual genres, and about what cultural patterns or discourses we might be able to draw. Okay, so now let's look at some techniques. And here we're looking at maybe some possible ways that we could get learners to engage with texts. So I'm going to walk us through some steps for designing a multiliteracies-oriented instructional sequence. And what I mean by meta way is now we're doing the applying of the experiencing and the conceptualizing the multiliteracies framework. But embedded within this is going to be an instructional sequence where we all might brainstorm an applying activity that our students could do, for example, if they were doing this sequence on the home texts. Okay. So first of all, first of all, we've got selecting texts. And you might have noticed that the text that I selected had a range of linguistic patterns. They progressed from being more narrative in nature to more expository. And in a way, this progression mirrors the linguistic development of learners. So that was intentional. Now, in a regular class sequence, maybe you wouldn't use all those texts. Maybe you would do them across an entire module. But the idea is to build up the discourse field through multiple texts, either multiple texts from different genres around a different theme, or multiple examples from one genre in order to see the variability from author to author, from text creator to text creator, or to focus on specific lexicogrammatical patterns. For example, here's another text type related to home. These are home exchange listings from French websites, which is the language that I teach. And these are all very different. It's the same genre. They're all from the same website. And so they're constrained a little bit in their form. There are pictures, there are titles, there's an image and profile of the proprietors. There are some details and keywords, and then there's a description. There's a section that says why we like our house or our home with some bullet points. So there's some constraints, but there's also quite a variation here. So often choosing texts, choosing multiple examples from one genre gets at the variability from author to author, demonstrating the way that we are always creating texts out of our own interests and identities, even if our purpose or our genre is on the surface appears to be similar. Okay, so then in terms of determining topic and genre, by topic, I don't mean grammar point necessarily. What I mean here is a cultural topic. So in some cases, these are going to be prescribed by a curriculum or the materials you're working with. In other cases, these might be open. If the topic is not prescribed, where do we start? So looking back at this graphic that we saw earlier, we used this to think about genres, and we knew the genre sort of intuitively, and we were identifying the recurrent linguistic patterns. But let's say our starting point is a grammar topic, and this is often the case in a grammar syllabus, which many of us still have in front of us. So notice I've just flipped these. We can ask ourselves then, what functions does a particular grammar point serve? So for example, adjectives are often used in a description. Okay, what sorts of texts are characterized by descriptions? We saw real estate ads, home exchange ads, we saw fiction. We saw everyday internet genres, for example. And same thing, we can ask ourselves what sorts of genres are characterized by nominalizations, embedded clauses. Well, definitely more expository texts. What kinds of texts tend to be expository in nature? Reports, informational texts, news articles, etc. Informational texts, scientific texts, technical texts, and things like that. So this I want to show you from Burns, Maxim, and Norris. They authored this in 2010 after undergoing a long curricular reform project at the Georgetown University German Studies Department. And they list a number of genre types for the different levels of the curriculum that they redeveloped. So this is fantastic for, I think, stimulating ideas about where to even start in finding texts. So what they did was map these out again across 4 years. 4 levels, I should say. It wasn't always years 1, 2, 3, 4, but it was 4 levels of curriculum. So let's say, for example, the cultural topic is food. Here are some genres that we could select right off the bat. But beyond just thinking about these flat genres, we could begin to think about discourses. So what are some different discourses surrounding the topic of food? We saw what some of these could be in thinking about home, at least in the discourse context that I built up for us through that collection of texts. But if we're sort of thinking in the abstract, what do people talk about? What do they think about in the cultural contexts that might be related to the languages we work with? And that isn't always one, right? There are multiple. Maybe we could think about discourses of fast food, maybe eating healthy, maybe the rising cost of food, or food waste, or food insecurity. So there are a lot of different ways that we can think about food that some of these genres might help us with. Some of the ones that I haven't highlighted might also still be helpful in helping us think about those discourses and helping us with students, helping introduce students to these discourses. So once, so in thinking about texts, I like to also draw on some of my more favorite quotes. And this comes from Paisani, who is quoting Swaffer, Ahrens, and Burns, that texts should treat topics that are familiar to beginning language students so that they can easily access background knowledge. And we know that learners need, all readers need a certain degree of background knowledge for success in reading a text. Text should contain enough fresh, unknown elements to give the learner frequent opportunities to hypothesize about their meaning, but should also at the same time have enough familiar, repeated elements to allow the learner to test their hypotheses and read at a considerable speed. So this is Paisani quoting Westhoff, 1991. So once we've selected our texts, the next step I like to call hanging out with your text. So in any of the texts that we saw about home, the linguistic patterns were really important to recognize and analyze and then sort of think about genre. And I spent a considerable amount of time hanging out with these texts to think about how we might talk about them in this context. So we've already done that. So if we're imagining that we're preparing a lesson using multiliteracies frameworks, we've done this part. We've identified the recurrent patterns. But next, we need to determine which patterns we want students to focus on. So this is going to be variable, of course, depending on learning outcomes for any curricular module. Choose and sequence instructional techniques would be the next step. And I've sort of put these together because they go hand in hand. We're going to inevitably determine a sequence once we have some techniques. These are 4 book-length treatments of multiliteracies, and they all contain a wealth of ideas about how to implement multiliteracies techniques in a classroom. Paisani, Ellen, and Dupree, the second one, is really good for frameworks for teaching reading, teaching video-mediated listening, etc. Pedagogy of Multiliteracies is also going to have quite a few techniques for engagement with texts, more in kind of a one-off format. So this is a framework from Paisani, Allen, and Dupree that I find extremely productive for engaging students in an interpretive capacity with texts. And notice that these don't really map onto the 4 curricular components. But if we think about the 4 curricular components, they're all sort of interspersed and interwoven in and through these activities. Okay, we saw this earlier as well. Okay, so, and these are some examples that come from this Learning by Design, New Learning Online website. These are some examples that come from that. So text annotation strategy, the text that we just looked at around home, maybe we give students a prompt and we ask them to annotate what we think are the salient features to get them to inductively come to some kind of hypothesis or interpretation of genre or context or authorship, to begin to think about maybe why that text exists and what its purpose is. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead here and show how we might apply this multiliteracies framework from Paisani, Allen, and Dupree through a 5-stage sequence around interpreting a text. And I'm going to choose the text that we already saw, this example number 4 about our rental home and the numerous problems. And we said that this was a testimonial. And if you remember, or if you don't, it was from the Habitat for Humanity website, which flashed very quickly. So we'll look at these in more detail. So as a pre-reading activity where learners access background knowledge, we might start with the logo or even part of the logo and ask students to describe, what shapes do you see? What figures do you see? Describe the position of the figures. What are they doing? What colors do you see? So I'll pause for a minute if anybody wants to offer a response to any of those questions in the chat. What shapes do you see? What figures? Describe the position or the relationship between the figures. What are they doing?
Kristen, I'm gonna read some of the things people are writing here.
Okay.
Some of this, people holding a roof, a family celebrating, they have a house, family sheltered by a solid house, a family covered by a house, hence suggests they are happy.
Good. Okay.
Community, someone saying community Aleida, right?
Mhm. Great. Yeah. So we have this idea of shelter, happiness, and now I've primed us all a little bit. We know what we're looking at. But if you were to bring something like this to learners fresh, they might come up with some of the same interpretations. And they might be helped a little bit by the title of this organization. They might also notice that there's a trademark. So Habitat for Humanity is not just a um, it's not just an arbitrary name or caption for this, but we might now notice this as a logo. If it's a logo, we might then start to think about or get students to think about what kind of organization this might be. So we might ask students, does your interpretation change with the words? Then we might say that this is the logo, and the text we're about to read comes from the website of this organization. Then maybe we would show a clip of the top of the website. So the idea here is that we're scaffolding interpretation of the text in a layered way. So look at the header. What kinds of activities do you think this organization promotes? Okay, so these are the kinds of questions that we might ask to students. So we're about to read an article written by one of the people pictured in these photos. What linguistic forms do you think you might find in the text? So we've already seen the text, but if learners were coming fresh to this activity, all of these different stages could be part of their pre-reading activity sequence in order to access background knowledge, but also begin to make predictions about what the text might be about and how the text might be realized. Okay, in initial reading, then we could show learners the text and ask them to scan the first paragraph for keywords associated with a home. Okay, so scan, keywords associated with home. And they might come up with some of these or all of these. And then maybe we could ask, what is the first paragraph about? Even if they haven't had a chance to read the entire paragraph, they might begin to get an idea based on this semantic field. We could ask, is the message generally positive or negative? And now we've seen already, this is a fairly negatively skewed paragraph. Look at the second paragraph. Do you see keywords associated with home or houses? Of course, there are none. Now the keywords in this paragraph are very different. They're associated with the program and people and a meeting and a school and the institution and these organizational things. And of course, we have thrilled. So it's a very different kind of paragraph. This is one obviously more positively skewed than the first. So in detailed reading, then we could ask learners to read the entire text, either out loud as a class or with each other, with a partner, asking them to pay attention to the context of the keywords and to note other words that they see associated with these words. So we saw here windows, carpets, faucets, ceiling, etc. And now we can look at the context in which these words live in this text. And we have problems. We have numerous problems: repair, limited, filth, cracks, damaged, etc. So we could give learners a worksheet in advance that asked them to list keywords associated with features of a house and leave a blank for them to then fill in any associations that they encounter in this stage. So they're working with language then in a very detailed way, in a way that's going to support linguistic development as well as interpretive skills. So in the next phase of critical reading activities, we could tell learners, for example, that this kind of text is a testimonial, and then maybe ask them what kinds of language forms help realize a testimonial. They might suggest personal pronouns or not. We might guide them there. We might ask them if they can think of other kinds of testimonials, if they've written one or given one in some other format. A testimonial doesn't have to be a written text. It could be a video blog or something like that. So once we have given students an opportunity to think about genre and language, we could then ask them, who do you think we refers to? We is obviously speaking for multiple people, but who's we? We, me and my classmates? Maybe. We, my family? Probably. So we can guide them to think more carefully about who these pronouns stand for. There's also a clear shift from we, primarily in the first paragraph, to I. Why does it shift from we to I? What has changed in terms of the way that this writer is narrating this particular testimonial? So in this stage, this critical reading activity stage, we want learners to think about textuality more broadly. So specifically in terms of the social context of production of a text. So we could ask, for example, is this testimonial truthful? Based on the fact that it's a testimonial for an organization that seeks to promote homeownership, this is likely a carefully constructed testimonial. What might be missing from this individual's account? There's more to the story here. What else is there that isn't stated? So throughout these stages, again, we're not only helping learners read and comprehend text, but we're helping them think about text external factors, including identities, including all the social and cultural and political dimensions behind the creation of texts. So in the final phase, knowledge application, there is a range of transformation tasks that learners could complete. One example is they could write the next paragraph about what happened after the family moved into their new home. So they could imagine all of the new positive features of their new home, describe these in a continuation of this testimonial. Or they could take the perspective of a Habitat staff member, respond to the testimonial, or the perspective of another family member and potential future, another family, not family member, but a different family and potential Habitat homeowner, and ask questions to this family, maybe in a blog style format, as if this were more of a conversation or a prompt for conversation. And you may think of many, many, many other ideas. So one thing to note in a reading sequence like this is that the knowledge application activities might extend beyond just one text. Obviously, the knowledge application activities that I've suggested here they're tied to this particular example, the Habitat for Humanity text, but they could also be bringing in these ideas from other texts that students have seen, that we've exposed them to throughout the module. So their knowledge application activities are going to hopefully be tapping their knowledge across all texts, across not even just one module, but multiple modules.
So thank you very much, Kristen. We really appreciate you being here with us today.
Thank you all. It's great to see you today. Thank you.
Kristen, thank you very much for being with us, everybody.